Coming up on Network Africa. Vote counting is underway in Guinea-Bissau's presidential election, with the incumbent José Mario Vaz facing stiff competition. Death toll from the weekend's landslide in Kenya rises to 56. Plus, the third batch of refugees from Libya detention centers arrive in Rwanda. Hello and a warm welcome to the program. I'm Teniola Shoboale. We begin this week with stories and happenings that made headlines over the weekend.
At least 27 people were killed on Sunday, including some people on the ground, after a plane crashed into a densely populated neighborhood in Goma, Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. The propeller plane operated by the local company BZB crashed shortly after takeoff en route to the city of Beni, which is about 250 kilometers to the north of Goma. The 19-seater Dornier 228-200 crashed with 17 passengers and 2 crew members on board. Air accidents are relatively frequent in Congo, and all Congolese commercial carriers, including BZB, are banned from operating in the European Union. The previous day, President Felix Tshisekedi officially inaugurated the National Museum in Kinshasa, where he said all of Congo's artifacts should eventually return. The museum, housed in a new building funded by the South Korean International Cooperation Agency, was completed in June, and the director of the museum says it will display more than 12,000 pieces tracing the history of the Congolese people in their current and past environment. Thousands of Congolese artifacts were taken during the colonial era by Belgium. The largest collection can be found in the Royal Museum for Central Africa in Tervuren, Belgium. Ethiopia's Sidama people have voted overwhelmingly to form their own self-governing region, as many of the country's ethnic groups demand greater autonomy under sweeping reform led by Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed. The country's electoral board says provisional results show 98.5% of voters backed the change in last week's ballot, with a turnout reaching 99.7%. The result grants the Sidama, who represent about 4% of Ethiopia's 105 million population, their own self-governing region, the country's 10th, control over local taxes, education, security, and certain legislation. Guinea-Bissau began counting ballots manually as voting seemingly passed without major incident. In a presidential election marred by weeks of political chaos that sparked protests and a deadlocked parliament. 61-year-old President José Mario Vaz is seeking re-election for a second term and remains popular among cashew nut farmers in the interior after raising prices for the nuts, which is the tiny West African country's #1 export. Vaz faces stiff opposition mainly from former Prime Minister Domingos Simões Pereira, who is considered a modernizer, which makes him popular among younger voters in Bissau.
So our main stories now. Vote counting is still on the way in Guinea-Bissau's presidential election, with the incumbent José Mario Vaz facing stiff competition after 5 years of political and economic turmoil. Polling day was calm despite outbreaks of violence in the lead-up to the election. A total of 12 candidates are running, including a former Prime Minister, Domingos Simões Pereira, emerging as a front-runner. Guinea-Bissau has had 7 prime ministers in the past 5 years. The country has had multiple coups since independence in 1974 and is used as a transit point for Latin American drugs bound for Europe. Results are expected on Thursday, and if no candidate receives more than 50% of the votes, a runoff will be held on December 29. Now to the tragic landslide that occurred in Kenya's West Pokot region over the weekend. The death toll from the disaster triggered by heavy rain has risen to 56. Regional Governor Professor John Lonyangalpu says hundreds of families have been made homeless and fled, with 30 other people still missing. Officials say 11 bodies are yet to be retrieved and the villages have been cut off by flooded roads. At least one bridge is reportedly been swept away. According to local media reports, a couple lost 7 children in the disaster. A statement from President Uhuru Kenyatta on Saturday contained his condolence message to the relatives and friends of the victims. As Kenya is experiencing a heavier than usual rainy season, weather experts in East Africa are warning of a continued heavy downpour that could bring more devastation, especially in landslide-prone areas. The third batch of refugees who were being held in detention centers in Libya have arrived in Rwanda in the early hours of Monday as part of a resettlement program. The refugees are mainly Eritrean and Somali nationals. The group was transported from Kigali Airport to the Gashora Transit Center, 40 kilometers east of the capital, where the other 189 refugees who arrived in September and October have been settled. The resettlement is part of an agreement between the Rwandan government, the UN Refugee Agency and the African Union. They agreed to resettle 500 out of more than 4,000 migrants being held in Libya after their illegal journeys to Europe was halted. The Bank of Lisbon building in Johannesburg's central business district has been demolished to make room for a yet-to-be-confirmed structure. The 34-story building made headlines in September last year when 3 firefighters lost their lives helping to put out the blaze that engulfed the upper floors of the building. According to the member of the Executive Committee for Infrastructure Development, Tasnim Mutara, 140 million rand was earmarked for the operation, but so far 90 million has been used.
The 108-meter Bank of Lisbon building stood, a shadow of itself, packed with 894 kilograms of explosives for the planned implosion, set to fall in a waterfall pattern so as not to affect buildings around. The 10 affected buildings had all been evacuated, and at 9 a.m. local time, the 31-story Bank of Lisbon building became rubble.
What is going to take place now is the removal of the protection from the 10 buildings or the buildings around around what used to be the Bank of Lisbon building, and the clearing of the roads.
What made this so difficult was having these other structures right around us in very close proximity. So that's the big challenge. If this building was sitting by itself out in the open, the demolishing would have been much, much simpler.
Back in the day, the building had been in use since the 1970s. It had been marked among 18 buildings occupied by government departments for refurbishment, but a fire from the 25th floor compromised the safety of the whole building in September 2018. 3 firemen lost their lives in that blaze, which went on for days. One of them missed his footing and actually plunged to his death from the 23rd floor. Members of the families of the deceased firefighters were present to witness the demolition, but declined to speak to the media. But the Gauteng MEC for Infrastructure Development, Tasnim Mutara, met with them after the demolition.
It's not an easy conversation to have. It's an extremely difficult conversation to have, because every time you do it, it's like you open up old wounds, and healing is a process, you know, and we've got to assist them on their journey towards healing.
To those living around the demolished building, this will all still take some getting used to.
I don't know how the view is going to be now without the building, but I'm just going to rush to my room now. Check the new view, you know, I was used to seeing this building.
It's going to be weird to see that space there, that, yeah.
I've known this building for many years, but I think it's a good thing to demolish it because we know we lost our firemen this year, I think, last year, so I think it's a good thing to put it down.
Clearing has already begun, and a brand new building, a provincial government department building, is expected to take the place of what used to be the Bank of Lisbon building, probably in a year or more. From Johannesburg, South Africa, Betty Dibia, Channels Television News.
Today is the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. It's a day set aside by the United Nations to bring to the fore issues and challenges women face in their everyday lives. Violence against women and girls is among the most widespread and devastating human rights violations in the world. But according to the UN, much of it is often unreported due to impunity, shame and gender inequality. The 2019 theme is Orange the World, Generation Equality Stands Against Rape. Like in previous years, this year's International Day will mark the launch of 16 Day of Activism that will conclude on December 19, 2019, which is International Human Rights Day. Take a listen to the UN Secretary General's Antonio Guterres' message for this year.
The United Nations is committed to ending all forms of violence against women and girls. These abuses are among the world's most horrific, persistent and widespread human rights violations, affecting 1 in every 3 women in the world. That means someone around you, a family member, a co-worker, a friend, or even you yourself. Sexual violence against women and girls is rooted in centuries of male domination. Let us not forget that the gender inequalities that fuel rape culture are essentially a question of power imbalances. Stigma, misconceptions, underreporting, and poor enforcement of the laws only perpetuate impunity. And rape is still being used as an horrendous weapon of war. All of that must change now. I call on governments, the private sector, civil society, and people everywhere to take a firm stand against sexual violence and misogyny. We must show greater solidarity with survivors, advocates, and women's rights defenders. And we must promote women's rights and equal opportunities. Together, we can and must end rape and sexual assault of all kinds. Thank you.
Back here in Nigeria, 96 is the number of complaints and memoranda so far received by the Presidential Special Investigation Panel on Sexual and Gender-Based Violence across the 6 geopolitical zones in the country. This was revealed by the National Human Rights Commission during its public sitting to check the scourge of sexual and gender-based violence in Nigeria. Our correspondent, Dare Idowu, reports.
Rise up for recognition. Thank you.
The 96 complaints are from the 6 geopolitical zones, with Southeast accounting for the highest number of cases reported. But the Commission says the cases are not based on prevalence on each of the regions.
We'll look at the roll call now.
More worrisome for the members of the panel is the culture of silence. The victims are either not reporting abuses or failing to show up when needed.
The number does not show the prevalence, really. Maybe it's a matter of awareness. What we are doing now, we're moving around the whole geopolitical zones, and part of the strategy is also encourage people to speak out. And one other way to also do this is if they see that people who come out are getting remedy and they are protected and not stigmatized, that's a practical way we think we can also make them to come out.
Widow abuse is considered the less likely issue to be raised here, but a widow, Omolola Omotesho, is bringing it up. She says she's willing to share her story, even as many are dying of silence.
Many widows are not even empowered. They don't have a job. So they can't even litigate. So when a fraud happens to you, the first thing is go to court, go and litigate. Where is the funds to do that? So I'm hoping that this panel, I'm so happy that they took on the petition we sent in, because we were expecting that they would say, oh no, we're only dealing with sexual violence, because that's what we have always heard.
Away from the commission's sitting, Omolola Omotesho is also bringing widows together with those who can help them lead a good life. They share their stories and also find solutions to them.
What widows pass through is just too much. When it comes to getting letter of administration, continue going there. Before I could get mine, I spent over 2 years. 2 years with money.
We need more widows. I'm happy that you were able to speak to some of them. That's the problem journalists have been having. When they want to speak, they say under conditions of anonymity. Even at the National Human Rights Commission, they said the panel will sit in private. Why should they be in private? They've stolen our things in public.
The 2015 Widows report by the Lumba Foundation says there are 258 million widows around the world, of which 3.5 million of them are Nigerians. The National Human Rights Commission says it will treat the cases before its investigation panel while encouraging more people to report cases of abuse against them. Dari Ido, Channels Television News.
Still to come on the program. The 41st Cairo International Film Festival kicks off with a lineup of both regional and international films. That's in a moment. Stay with us.